One of the trickiest questions to answer in poker is what exactly is somebody's poker hand range? And it's a tricky question because we know everybody plays aces, but the question is what else do they play, or what are their pre-flop standards? One of the things we can try to do to answer that question is look at what their betting patterns are and what they like to do in certain situations, which leads us to ask what exactly are their tendencies. For example, we could have a really aggressive player that bets often. They're going to have a different range than a passive player or a conservative player that may just check call and not play a lot of hands in certain situations. So we have to know what their tendencies are. Now, if a conservative player is aggressive with a really small range, we could be in a lot of trouble unless we have the absolute best hand. Another thing we look at is whether or not the range is polarized, and by polarized, typically it can be the nuts or air. Essentially, you're betting really strong hands or betting nothing. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the merged range, and some players like to bet straight draws, middle pair, bottom pair, top pair, over pairs. They bet a little bit of everything, even ace high. Now, there's a lot of possibilities we can be dealt pre-flop. If we translate this starting hands, we can be dealt to combinations. If we go to the suited cards, there's 4 possible combinations for each one. There's 6 possible combinations for each pocket pair, and there's 12 possible combinations we can be dealt for each offsuit card. So each possible hand, let's say ace king, we can be dealt up to 16 cards, and if we add all that together, we get 1,326 combinations we can be dealt pre-flop. Now, obviously, nobody or most players don't play every single hand, so we can narrow that range down. And if we look just at suited cards, for example, ace-king suited or other cards like that, there's 312 combos, and that accounts for approximately 23.5% of possible cards one could be dealt. So if someone played every single suited card, they would play at least 23.5% of hands. And if you add pocket pairs, with pocket pairs, there's from aces to deuces, there's 78 possible combinations you can be dealt, and that comes out to 5.9%. And then the last but not least are the remaining cards, the offsuit cards, the non-suited cards. There's 936 combos of that, and that accounts for 70.6%. So that accounts for the majority of the cards or the junk we get dealt. Now, one of the things we look at when we're estimating a player's range is a static range, where they have the same range in different situations. They basically do the same thing or play the same cards every time. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a dynamic range type player, where their players a little more cognitive of position, and sometimes they'll play really loose, other times they'll play really tight. So they're a little tougher to peg. And one example of a dynamic range player might be, okay, this player plays 20% of hands, or raises with 20% of hands, let's say. And on the cutoff, they're going to widen that range. They're going to raise like 30% of the time. And then conversely, under the gun, they're going to raise 10% of the time. And the 10% of the time is a much stronger range. Now, they average 20%, but if they're raising under the gun, their raises are stronger. And if they're raising from the cutoff, their raises are typically weaker or more trash hands or speculative hands. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give an example of a range, and we're going to make it really straightforward. We're just going to assume that this particular player has a Broadway range, and by Broadway I mean Jack 10 offsuit or better and a pair of 10s or better. There's going to be 190 combinations in this range, and that's going to account for 14.3% of the hands dealt. We're going to do a board here of 973, and we want to know how often does that range hit the board. And that's a good question, or how often can that range beat the board is a better question. So if we break it down further, we notice there are 30 combinations of overpairs, and of the 190 combos, that amounts to 15.8%. So 15.8% of the time, a Broadway range can beat a top pair or a pair of nines. Now, the other portion of that range is overcards, and that accounts for 160 combos, or most of that range. And in that case, 84.2% of the time, Broadway range cannot even beat a pair of deuces. Moving back to our Broadway range here, we're going to go to the river. Now I've added a 5 of spades and a king of spades. 5 of spades for the turn, king of spades for the river. We still have 190 combos, and one of the things we have to do is we need to subtract the 19 combinations of the king of spades, which I've highlighted on the left there. We need to subtract that, and that gives us down to 171 combos. If we're playing against the Broadway range can have 171 combos on this board on the river. And then, okay, well, how does that break down? Well, 52.6% of the time, that range is not going to have a pair. So more than half the time, can't beat a pair of threes, can't beat bottom pair on the board. 3.5% of the time, that range is going to have a flush. 28.1% of the time, that range is going to have a pair of kings. 1.8% of the time, that range is going to have a really strong hand, and it's 3 kings. And then the remaining 14% of the time, there's going to be pocket pairs. 6 combos for aces for an overpair, and then 18 combinations for like 10s, jacks, and queens. So, like I said, 52.6% of the time, this range cannot beat bottom pair. Now, narrowing down a player's range can be rather tricky. There's, like I said, 1,326 pre-flop combinations, but we can narrow that down depending on how tight or loose a player plays. One of the advantages of being able to do it correctly is we can really narrow down our options in certain spots. We have a good feel for where our hand is at in terms of relative value, and that helps us make decisions whether or not to get additional value out of a hand or even to fold in situations for beat. I mean, we're still losing, we just lose less than we should. So if we're really good at that, they can add a lot of value. But remember, it's very difficult to narrow it down, and of course if you put garbage in for your data, and you're going to get garbage out. So that's an overview of how we look at a poker hand range. Thank you for watching.